going to go ahead and get started since we're at 1:05. Thanks for being here today. I am Steph Regus. I'm going to be covering ouch and oops, handling awkward conversations, and missteps. I might have some technology snafus, as this is always interesting for me. Technology can be challenging. Our agenda today, though, is to do some introductions for myself and my colleague, who unfortunately is not here, some icebreakers, and kind of just some starting questions. And then we're going to watch a little video on pronouns, kind of pronouns 101, go over some ground rules for sensitive conversations, and what to do if you do make a mistake in some of these conversations. And then we'll end with some resources and hopefully some time for some questions. All right, so this is my friend and colleague, Kayla Vargas. Unfortunately, they were unable to be here today. So I will be kind of covering the topics today. Again, I'm Steph. My pronouns are she, her. And one thing that I know that was really important for both Kayla and myself to acknowledge is that this conversation is multifaceted. And although we are focusing on the LGBTQ conversation, there is a lot of intersectionality within this conversation. And so, there's other places that we can apply these tools and where these conversations can come up. I also like to just point out that I'm not an expert on these things. I'm not a member of the LGBTQ community. But my hope is to show up as an ally today in these conversations. And that being said, I would really love for other people to share their knowledge or their opinions, either by unmuting yourself or through the chat. I think you should have those abilities. But yeah, to be able to contribute to this conversation. All right, so first icebreaker is, as we're getting into this conversation, when it comes to approaching challenging conversations, what are your worries and fears? What comes up for you? And feel free to unmute yourself and speak to that, or put it in the chat. Try to keep an eye on the chat. Incompetence, absolutely, that's a big one. Yeah, feeling like you might make a mistake. That's a big one, and that comes up in, like I said, many intersecting conversations, not just this one. But fear of stepping on other people or hurting them. Absolutely. Anything else? Any other fears that come up? I know another one that can come up is, what if I disagree? Will it be something we can have a conversation about? I'm doing the double screen thing, so if I miss something in the chat, somebody just shout me out, and I'll make sure to check on it, because that pops up in a different screen for some reason. All right, another question. Have you ever made a mistake, like misgendering somebody? And if so, how did you respond? What do you do? Maybe have you responded in a way that you wish you hadn't, or in a way that you were proud of? Any thoughts on that? All right, so trying to correct yourself and maybe making it worse, maybe making yourself more uncomfortable, maybe making the person that you have made a mistake with uncomfortable. Absolutely. Anybody else have any other thoughts? I know this one is, and Kayla, I think, would agree that we all make mistakes, and Kayla is one to say that they also make mistakes, right? And they're one where people make a lot of mistakes with their gender as well, and so being able to own that. Right. And I know I've learned a lot, since I've become aware of a lot of these things, and I made a lot of mistakes, and, put myself in uncomfortable positions, put others in uncomfortable positions, and being willing to continue to learn and continue to challenge yourself and continue to correct that can be key in these conversations, and in any area, really. So I'm going to go ahead and play this video. It looks incredibly blurry.
One of the simplest ways to be inclusive to your peers is to use pronouns intentionally. Pronouns are how we refer to other people or talk about someone in the third person. You're probably already familiar with some pronouns, as most often we use he or she. However, there are more pronouns than you realize. You don't want to assume someone's pronouns either. Although we're used to using he or him when referring to a male and she or her when referring to a female, these associations are not always accurate. Before we review some common pronouns you might come across, you might also see pronouns referred to as preferred pronouns. I encourage you to stray away from using that term. By saying preferred, it comes off as an option to use the pronouns that someone requests. When someone shares or corrects you about their pronouns, those are the ones you use. This chart refers to 4 common pronouns someone might use. We have she, her, hers, and he, him, his, which you're likely familiar with. Then we have they, them, theirs. This is a bit tricky for some folks to adjust to using plural pronouns for singular nouns. I promise it's okay. The last ones are sie, zer, zerself, or sie, self. Someone might use these last 2 pronouns when they feel like the more gendered pronouns don't capture how they identify. These tend to be considered more gender nonconforming pronouns. You can see we have example sentences such as they are speaking and the bag is theirs. I encourage you to pause and try these out aloud. Something to know about pronouns is that someone can identify with more than one set. If they share more than one, that means that you can use any of those pronouns when referring to them. There are way more than the 4 pronouns we covered that exist. If someone shares pronouns that they use that aren't these 4, you should use them. You don't need to feel pressure to memorize all the pronouns, but I encourage you to explore more. Also, you should always ask someone their pronouns or use they, them pronouns until you know their pronouns. Since they, them pronouns are gender neutral, it doesn't assume how someone identifies. It's always best to ask, though. If you want to know someone's pronouns to avoid using the wrong one, just simply say something like, "Hey, I'm Alex. My pronouns are they, them." If you feel comfortable, please share yours. Or, "I'm sorry, I forgot your pronouns. Would you mind reminding me? I use they, them, theirs pronouns." I typically say, "Hey, I'm Michelle. My pronouns are she, her." If you feel comfortable, please share yours. Or maybe you know someone's pronouns, but a friend or colleague is misusing them. You can say, "Don't forget Maria uses ze, zer, zers pronouns." It's a great way to hold one another accountable. Mistakes will happen. You're going to slip up on a pronoun. I've used the wrong pronouns before. When it does happen, I correct myself and move on. You don't need to dwell on it. What's important is fixing the mistake you made. To use pronouns, you need to get in the habit of using them and finding ways to implement them. For example, putting them in your email signature or next to your name on a Zoom call. Maybe when you meet someone new, you make sure to include your pronouns in that introduction. If your team or company hasn't implemented ways to know one another's pronouns, team up with human resources to figure it out. By implementing pronouns and making it a norm, you're able to advocate for yourself and how you'd like to be represented, as well as your peers, so they know you understand not everyone identifies the same. That will help them feel comfortable to show up authentically.
All right, any thoughts on that video? Or any questions that come up? Anything new? Let me check the chat here.
I guess I have a question.
Mhm.
What are some of the responses that you get from folks who are learning about, so, we're just starting to add these pronouns into our Zoom names.
Mhm.
And some folks, they're really uncomfortable with it, when they're outside of this environment. And so what are some of the things that folks say, and what do you think are like a good way to have a brief but educational conversation with folks?
Yeah, that's a really great conversation, and that is something that has come up in my world as well. And one way that I think about this conversation, and it really is just thinking about showing up as an ally. You know, even if you don't fully understand where somebody is coming from, this is one way that we can help individuals who are oftentimes marginalized, right? And there's high suicide rates, higher suicide rates. There's a lot of mental health challenges, and so one way that we can help to alleviate any stress in that area is by doing things like sharing our own pronouns, right? And no matter what environment you are in, being able to alleviate the pressure of somebody who maybe uses they, them, or easier pronouns to make that a comfortable environment, so that that's not something they have to hold themselves. I'm not sure if I fully answered that question. Did I?
You
did I
did.
answer that well?
Yeah, I really appreciate that. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. All right. So getting into, there we go, some ground rules. First thing that I always say is, before entering into some of these conversations, like I think it was you, Lauren, that said worried about feeling incompetent, do a little research. You know, stop, drop, and Google it. There's a lot of information out there. And you can find it on YouTube, you can find information on Google, you can find information on social media. There's a lot of places to find information on these things like pronouns. And so educate yourself, right? Before putting that education on somebody else and putting that weight on somebody else to hold. Another really important thing is asking for consent, right? So if we're asking to enter into a conversation that may be more emotionally taxing for the other person, or maybe we're asking for education in a certain area, asking, do you have the capacity for me to ask you a question about this? Is now a good time? And then being okay with whatever that answer is. Maybe it's not. Maybe they've had a hard time with being misgendered or discriminated against, and so to ask for education in that area is just not appropriate in that time. And that's okay, but getting that consent, and also being willing to set the boundaries if you're the one being asked for that consent, and saying, no, it's not a good time, is really important, right? So that's stating what your needs or your boundaries are when entering into a conversation of, hey, yeah, I'm willing to have a conversation with you, but maybe talking about your own personal experience in that time is just too much at that time, right? Too sensitive. And so talking about those things. Any thoughts about that, or questions about consent or boundaries in those conversations, or even Googling it? Check the chat again. Yeah, and this is also one where, kind of going back to what I talked about with the intersectionality of these things apply to all sorts of conversations on race and ethnicity. These are really good practices just to get into if you're going into a conversation, especially from somebody, like myself, who is, has very many privileged parts of my identity. Getting used to that just being a part of the conversation and saying, do you have the capacity to talk about this right now? Or even recognizing maybe I should Google this before I even ask for that consent. All right. There's no questions. Going to go ahead and move on. So that part of that last slide was saying, how do we practice this? And one of the ways we can practice this is by using the Imessage Formula, right? And so these I statements can be sort of a way to work through uncomfortable conversations. And it consists of these 4 parts. So basically saying, I feel blank when blank, and because blank, and this is what I need, right? And so we use this example of, I feel stressed when administrators don't let us know the plans for school, because I want to teach and support my students in the best way possible. I need leaders to provide better communication to educators. Can anybody think of any similar scenarios to use I statements? Yeah. So one that Kayla and I had talked about is, let's say somebody misgendered them, right? So they might say, I feel frustrated when you misgender me because my pronouns are they, them. I need you to get my pronouns correct, or I need you to work on that a little bit harder, right? And so it's being very straightforward, and it's communicating that, what's going on, what Kayla's feeling in being misgendered. Back there. Any thoughts on that? We're moving forward. Go ahead and move forward then. All right, so what to do when you do make a mistake? Because like I said, Kayla and I both we make mistakes, and especially in entering into this conversation, like you were saying, Lauren, that this is maybe a new thing in your area. We're going to make mistakes, and being okay with that, and then figuring out how do I address that when I do. So one way that's really easy, whether it's in your workplace, I work at the student counseling services. And so, we use it a lot of times in groups with clients, with our own team here. So we use ouch and oops. And ouch and oops is basically just coming to this understanding where if somebody says something that was offensive to you, just being able to say, ouch, in that conversation, then that, signals to the other person, something you said hurt my feelings, right? Something you said rubbed me the wrong way. And so the other person can say, oops, like, what did I do? What was it that I said that was harmful or hurtful to you? And in that you're allowing this conflict to happen. You have this sort of standard way, even having this in like your friends group, being able to address things instead of just like walk away from it. And sometimes, people may not have the capacity to enter in that conversation, and that's okay. But this is just a really quick and easy way to do that, kind of deal with that conflict. And if you see me looking over again, I'm looking at that chat, so apologize for that. Another thing is, don't over apologize if you make a mistake. It's awkward, right? So for example, one of the things that Kayla and I were going to role play is, let's say you misgender somebody. The worst thing that you can do is kind of being like, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. Oh man, will you forgive me? I want to, I'm working on it, and just making a big deal about it. Because what you're doing in that situation is you're sort of centering your own needs, right? Like, I feel bad or I feel guilty. And so then the person who you've either offended or misgendered, they now are in the position to sort of comfort you, right? And in this position to say, oh, it's okay, that's all right, don't worry about it. And they end up, being put in that awkward position, not to mention feeling awkward if it's in like a meeting or around other people. So don't over apologize. Rather, just correct yourself, right? For the most part, and people can have differing opinions on this. Individuals that I know, they prefer if you just correct their pronoun, say the right pronoun, and then move on, right? Rather than calling it out and making a big deal about it in front of other people or stopping the conversation. That starts to put the light on you and center you in your needs rather than the person that you've harmed. Does anybody have any thoughts on that? Or have you, this was kind of that question in the beginning of when you have maybe misgendered somebody, what do you do?
That was so helpful. I'm guilty of having made it about my mistake instead of about correcting and honoring. And so I really appreciate you providing that example. Thank you.
Yeah, me too, honestly. And that's something that a lot of people don't think about, like how do you respond to that? How do people want to, you to respond to that? And like I said, everybody's different. Some people might want an apology, and that's okay. But hopefully they would tell you about that. But from what the people I've encountered or educational things that I've encountered, just correcting yourself and moving on in the conversation. That way you're honoring what that person's pronouns are, but you're also not centering it on you. Another thing is things like, I'm trying to think of some examples. Let's say you misgender somebody when they're not there. Again, correcting yourself. You don't need to go tell that person that you've misgendered them. You don't need to go out of your way to like make them feel like you care, or, you know, do something to make up for it. Again, that's centering yourself. And so not putting more of that work on them. Another example I can think of is asking somebody for, you know, if you've misgendered them, and then asking, oh, are there resources that you can provide me to teach myself more about this, or to give to or donate to, right? Because now you have tasked this person, you have not only hurt their feelings or harmed them by misgendering them, but you now have tasked them with educating you and providing you resources. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and move forward. So this, here we go. So this next thing is kind of speaking to that. It's a little comic, and I'll give you a moment to read it, but this comic is a great example of what not to do, right? Kind of how somebody could center it on themselves. So I'll give you a few minutes to look over that. If you have any thoughts on that, like what problems do you see in this response? So the problem with this is that this individual is, again, centering themselves over the person that they are talking to, who maybe is not cis. And so to center that on themselves and kind of what they would call cis guilt, right? Of this, putting it about myself, making it about myself, is not something that is appropriate in a conversation. And we should try to avoid. All right, and then as I kind of come to a close to, here are some resources. I'm going to also I'll put these in the chat before the end of the session today, but these are a couple websites that have really great resources as allies or information on LGBTQIA resources. So I would definitely recommend checking those out. I also, I have to plug and advertise for student counseling services. We do also have a resource called Wildcat Care 365, which is 24/7 care for students, CWU students. So you can get medical care, you can get mental health care, and this should be a safe place for people to be able to go and talk with somebody, whether it's just a drop-in clinic or it's scheduling individual sessions. We also are available at student counseling services, not 24/7, but from 8 to 5. So I would encourage people to reach out to those resources. All right, any questions or thoughts, questions about the resources, or what we do at student counseling services? All right, well, that's what I have for today. I appreciate y'all being here. I hope that you had some takeaways. I'm here to answer any questions or discuss any parts of this presentation that maybe stood out to you.